So as a project manager, we have to use inclusive language. And in my career, it's things have changed, and obviously the world is changing to where we have to be more considerate. And I use the word compassion um, as I understand, because we're all individuals. And in a project that I was on, we had, of course, you have a little chit chat and talk about things. And, one of the individuals was talking about their partner. Um, and, from the era I grew up in, it was, like a spouse or a husband or wife or what have you. But partner is kind of one of those inclusive languages. Um, some of the things that I will say or that I use as like guys or him or her is not to be offensive, but it's been something that I have consciously strived in all my projects. I like to use names. I like to find out kind of who people are so that I can connect with them a little better during my projects. And so as I discuss the various different conditions of projects I've been on, I may use the words guys or him or her, but I mean no offense to it. And I want to provide inclusive language in everything that I do. And so keep that in mind as we move forward. And I am grateful for the opportunity to do this interview.
Hi, Robert. Thank you for volunteering and being willing to do this with me today, to create this, let's call it like an aggregate case study for the students in this class. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries.
Excellent. I'm going to jump right in and ask you to describe a project. Tell me about the project. What were the project goals? What were some of the things that were known about the project environment from the start in terms of who the players were and what maybe the problem was that they were trying to tackle to either solve a problem or take advantage of some new opportunity perhaps, and just kind of like just describe the big picture for us for any project that you choose to talk with us about.
Cool. Yeah, no worries. So I'm going to start with a project that I did just recently, actually, where it was that we had to build a framework for a cybersecurity group, and within this framework, I was given a business analyst. Sorry for the my fumbling of words there. I was given a business analyst, several senior cybersecurity analysts, along with an executive sponsor who was the CISO, or the Chief Security Information Officer, who kind of basically chartered the project to get started. The foundation of this project was when I was assigned the project. I was reviewing the charter and the use case. There wasn't a whole lot of information on that. And in today's society, AI is becoming very popular. And so I started to use a little AI to help me define and to write more clearly some of the objectives in the charter. The goal was that we built a framework for digital trust, using a specific methodology and also put together a goal or a roadmap of 3 to 5 years of how we're going to accomplish that. And so I had to proceed to go out and find the right amount of people. We had to do discovery and so forth. And so that's the foundation of that particular project.
And so was this to deal with, this was in a cybersecurity context. So was that dealing with specific threats that had already been documented, or was this to like upgrade things and get things where they needed to be
Yeah.
technologically.
Yeah. So the way that we had to deal with that was there was some new regulations coming out in 2024. And there were threats that were happening, not just at the organization I was at, but at other, just around the general industry. And one of the Gartner reports states that, in 2024 or in 2023 to 2024, cyber attacks will go up tenfold, and the use of AI will go up as well. And so this obviously opens up for the problem of how do you manage and take care of your networks and your infrastructure and all the things that you need to manage, especially in a higher education institution or in any other kind of a corporate world setting. How do you manage access and management and manageability of that? And so these were basically off the use case, were foundational stuff that it had happened, and it's predicted to continue to happen. And so we needed to build a framework for digital trust, or a cybersecurity methodology, if you will. Framework's a little less prescriptive, um, to help address the up and coming, not only cyber attacks that will be coming and that eventually will be occurring, but also regulations and compliance and other things that will be cropping up as well, because the industry is constantly changing.
And that I like how you describe that, because that sort of situation is the impetus for a lot of different projects in a lot of different industries, is that there's new regulations or laws, and there's new threats coming from somewhere, and senior individuals with high levels of authority and decision making within organizations become aware of these threats and things, and sometimes the directive is sort of like, oh no, this is really bad, we got to protect ourselves from this, and that's about all they know about it, right? Like, they don't have the individuals who are the sponsor of of a project like this, sometimes know very little about what what needs to be done. They're
Yeah.
just like, get something done to protect us from this.
Yeah.
And do you think that played a role here in what you were referring to when you said there wasn't a lot of information and things were kind of vague?
Yeah, absolutely. Because thinking back on, even 8 years ago, I was read in, via an attorney on the if you guys all remember the I don't know if you'll remember, but about 2016 there was the intrusion with the U.S. government, the credit history, the credit, with social security numbers and birth dates, and hackers were going in and pulling out all this information, to basically create new identities and steal people's money, and create havoc throughout the United States. I think it was like billions and billions of, not billions, but maybe hundreds of millions of Americans, were their identity was stolen. And so the Security Exchange Commission came down. This is another company I worked for, and said, hey, you had a breach, you need to fix it. So, it was a security project, but as an example of, regulations and changing and compliance and how things are always, changing. The hackers, or the people that go in and steal this information, are always constantly changing up how they do things. And so we had to go in and fix our system to block actually they found a vulnerability. And so in this project I was read in, it was kind of a spur of the moment thing. I was invited to a meeting last minute, went into it, and then the next thing I know, they says, "Well, you've been ready and you're now the project manager, but you can't tell anyone." I couldn't tell my executive staff. I couldn't tell the PMO management. I couldn't tell anybody. And so whenever we referred to the project, it was always referred to as my top secret project. But we were able to get that fixed and secured and taken care of. It was a code or a an application issue on our side, which the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission, was ready to fine us, for
Wow.
having this breach. In fact, project managers need to be very transparent and collaborative, and it was very hard not to discuss key components of this, with individuals. I mean, from a stakeholder management standpoint, I had to learn how to inform my stakeholders that were, kind of asking about the project in a way that I wasn't breaching any confidential information or what we were doing.
Right.
From a team standpoint, it was tough. I mean, it wasn't tough on the side of the core team because they were all read in as well, and so we had confidentiality, but we couldn't record meetings. We couldn't,
Right.
discuss
Right.
certain things.
And
Yeah. So it's from
and
a
not being
team
able to
aspect,
record
it's hard.
meetings to be able to go back and say, okay, what was that one
What was
detail?
said.
And
Yep.
just the
Yeah.
stress on everybody from that.
Mhm.
That's a really
Yep.
interesting component that in
Yep.
that project that you're discussing. And it also affected the stewardship that you were responsible for, right? In terms of
Yes.
um,
Absolutely.
demonstrating the elements of stewardship. I'm just going to read them: integrity, care, trustworthiness, and compliance. That was the way that had to be implemented for that particular project was definitely a major component for
Yeah.
that had a much wider reaching, like, sort of ripple effect on the project.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes, and
that's
not just that,
fascinating.
on the organization and everything else. And the one thing that, thinking about the case study of this interview, system thinking, right? I had to do some system thinking. How is our systems, how do the systems work? How do they interact with the domains and the platforms? How do
Right.
they, and so there was some critical thinking on my part. Yeah, and then just to tie into that one more thing, tailoring, right? I mean, that's a PMI term that people use. How do you tailor the approach? And since I couldn't talk to anybody about this, I had to tailor my communication to various different stakeholders, and how I did that. And so it's from a case study perspective, I think that's a great question to be asking on anything we do: is how do we tailor what we do, right? And how do we tailor it to um, to the conditions that we're under? And just to think of tailoring on one other aspect, I'm actually in the process of completing a project now, currently, where I had to tailor. I had to take it from a methodology and move it to a framework, and it was a suggestion provided by one of the core team members. As we were looking at the methodology, it was too prescriptive. It just didn't fit, and so we had to modify and tailor it. And it's funny that it doesn't matter how big or how small your project is, complexity of the project can really, affect how you tailor or how you attack or how you adapt to the project, because I don't think necessarily time frame is what dictates complexity. I think complexity has to do with all the various aspects of what you have to do, whether you have to do a reset or whether you have to um, just think about multiple things. The project could only take 6 months, but the complexity could be very high. I know that there are projects that take 2 years, 3 years, and their complexities are even higher. So
Absolutely. Can you talk about a project? It can be that project you refer to, or a different one, and talk about some of the context of the project around the players involved, like the influencers, or who was involved over the lifespan of the project. Was it the same people involved from the start all throughout, or were there different constituencies perhaps that had different kinds of requirements or desires for the project outcomes, and they came in and out of the project at different times? Or just like to, describe the
yeah,
context of a project like that.
yeah, no worries. In fact, in that same project, the complexity of dealing with the executive sponsor. When I was pulled into the project, it had already been going for 4 or 5 months. They really, I shouldn't have been going anywhere, but they were really struggling with a goal and trying to figure out. When I attended one of their meetings, they were talking about 10 different topics, and I was like, holy, I was just like, wow, that's just way too much to talk about in a 30-minute meeting. And so they introduced the complexity without realizing they were introducing the complexity. And so I usually set time with the executive sponsor to discuss project needs and conditions and goals and direction, and to make sure that we are aligning um, with the original charter outcome. And if things need to change, then they change, but there's a process for that. The problem with this project is that uh, about midway through, it was put on hold, and we had a conflict we had to deal with. And once the conflict was over, we spun back up again. And then as I began talking with that same executive, there was another executive who had a big buy-in piece. He was actually going to reside eventually in her portfolio, or in her group. And she decided that she wanted to, insert a few extra goals and items and things. And so the project went back on hold again. And I had a discussion with that executive, which is a rare discussion. Most executives are so busy, they don't have time to discuss ownership of projects half the time. But she came to me and said, hey, we'd like to go back on hold so we can discuss who will own this, who will make the decisions. And to me, I was applauding that. I was like, holy smokes, you guys are um, are finally making great decisions here. It's obvious. I mean, not that they don't, but from a project standpoint, I was excited that they. And so I went back to my core team and said, hey, we're going on hold for a few weeks so an executive can make a decision. The decision came back that I shifted from one exec to another exec, which caused us to reset and change a few of the goals, which actually simplified the project, made it much easier for us to deal with, especially with going outside and working with other cross-functional groups and teams to help us complete the project.
I like the way you described that, because sometimes these things can seem so simple, and they're not at all. And you mentioned a couple of things that are I've seen occur many times on projects, and I think they're things that for me are like, there's flashing lights around it when these things happen. And the one thing you said was a project being put on hold, that should catch some of the attention. And also, when you're brought into a project that's been going on for a while, but that it has way too many objectives or goals all intermingled, and it hadn't really like gone very far. Um, And I think those two things are hard to look for, and yet they're really key indicators of where the challenge areas are for a project manager.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah. Go
and
ahead.
I have to think that you have seen other projects that had similar for you, like those flashing lights kinds of things going on.
Yeah.
Is there something that you could talk about some other projects where for you it was like, okay, that to me, that really caught my attention, and I knew I needed to go in that direction to figure out what was going on there.
Yeah, I think that brings it down to structure, right? I think as a project manager, our goal is to facilitate, but to bring structure and the critical thinking, kind of be that third party Switzerland, if you will, right? To where we come in, and over my career, I have seen, I mean, there have been projects I look at, and then all of a sudden the red lights go off, right? The red flags pop up, and I'm like going, oh, I've seen that before, you know. How do I approach that? That's the question I always ask myself. Or I always take time. I think if you make decisions rashly or quickly, and I'm not talking like in a day or two. I'm talking like in the next 5 to 10 minutes or during that meeting. I think sometimes they're too rash, right? Especially if you're looking at a complex um, problem, and you've got to be, adaptable. You got to be resilient. You got to be able to say, well, what's the right thing to do for the organization? I was, on another project managing the situation similar, and I had a new project manager who was brand new, never done it before, who's shadowing me on the project. And that project manager was like when we had a conflict arise there as well. That person was like, no, she didn't understand what was going on. And my management came back and said, hey, can you let's just remove her off. And I was like, no, let's not remove her off. Let's keep her on and let her see how at least I have dealt with the project conflict. And because I think that everyone's creative enough to, as long as you've got a level head and you understand the complexities of what you're doing, solutions arise, and more heads are better than one anyways. And it was great to see her, as she followed me or shadowed me on that, start to understand um, that these things happen, and it happens time and time again, unfortunately, with the human behavior that we all experience, and so it's I guess, kind of going back to the principles of PMI, with leadership and system thinking, quality, complexity, risk, adaptability, resiliency, even change. I think it's important for us to understand the conditions of what we're working on, um, and then use our own creative thinking, critical thinking, if you will, um, to apply to that situation. I think and sometimes it solves the problem, sometimes it doesn't, and you have to be ready for when you don't solve those problems. But I hope I answered your question. I know there's a lot of
When the client or the executive sponsor really doesn't know what they want.
yeah,
And that's a hard thing to talk about, because we project managers, we only exist, our function, our purpose, our role is to um, help our client achieve their goals. And if they don't know what they want, right? Like, and if they're receiving pressure from their peers or from uh, other levels within the organization, if they're receiving pressure to get something done, um, but they're not, if they're struggling with getting their arms around, well, what is it that I want this project to accomplish? What should be the goals? Like
yeah,
you said in that one, when you were brought in and they had what you said, in a half an hour meeting, they had way too many things to try to cover in that. And that can be really common. That's a sign that it's a group that doesn't really know what they want, when you've got, kind of the kitchen sink approach to like what this project should be accomplishing,
Yeah.
and how to tease those elements out, clarify them in ways that those can be presented back to the client or the executive sponsor for them to make those decisions like you described in that situation.
I think maybe the 10 items that we talked about wasn't that some of them weren't needed. It was we needed all of them. It's the case of boiling the ocean, right? Or maybe taking a cup of water and boiling it, right? With all the rivers running to the ocean as an analogy, right? Or eating the elephant all at once versus breaking it down into smaller chunks where you can, provide an outcome or a solution. I think that's the problem we run into, and I think our executives have such a high level view of what they want, they don't know how to define it. And as a project manager, it's our job to come in and kind of define those and to figure that out and to help them, come to that. But I think early on in my career, when I was not even thinking about being a project manager and I was in operations, I had, we were boiling the ocean all the time, and we were talking about, we were here, there, and everywhere. And I think just naturally I wanted to bring structure, right? I says, okay, what do we need to tackle first? And what's the natural progression of it? And then it wasn't later in, maybe a few years later when I got a hold of a PMBOK and I started going through it, and I was like, oh, I've done this and this and this and this and this. And I realized, oh man, and that's where I gained my love for project and portfolio management. Because it's something, there's always something different. You deal with stuff like that all day long, but I think it's very interesting to, I think the biggest advice I would give, particularly with this interview and case study, would be to break things down, just break them down to manageable sizes.
Exactly. And, it's not one of the 12 principles, but I like the way you referred back to what you did decades ago. And when I think back and do that same sort of thing, um, the requirements analysis kind of work that I did decades ago was similar to what you're talking about, right? In terms of providing some structure for documenting what the requirements were and clarifying that, and then prioritizing them.
Yeah.
And there's that the need for that in the field of project management is never going to go away. The capacity to always be focused on what are the requirements, let's make sure they're really clear, and let's prioritize them.
I would tie that into leadership, right? I mean, we all have leadership styles, but essentially the PMI or the PMBOK says leadership promotes project success and contributes to positive project outcomes. And so anytime we do something to produce a positive project outcome, that could be not just utilized during the project, but an operational outcome, or something that could be used throughout the years, especially in a 3 to 5 year roadmap. Your leadership, you're building leadership skills, and so I mean, we could almost tie everything we do back to some form of the 12 kind of main areas that PMI explains. Projects that my teams were such rock stars that I was able to set the direction and just stand back and then just get updates, reported updates from them. And those guys they just like boom, boom, boom. They produced outcomes. And when we first talked about it on that one project, on a project, I asked them, I says, we need to have 10 outcomes in the next 4 months. And they are like, no way, there's no way. And then they were a little overwhelmed. And then that's where I adapted. And I said, okay, how about just give me this one outcome? When can you do that? And then when they were 50%, 60% done, I came back and said, hey, how about this outcome? And then I just kind of set that direction and gave them that lead. But they just picked up, and then before they knew it, they had all of them done. And they were sitting back at the end of that going, I can't believe we did all that. And they did it faster and than what they did before. And
That must have been really exciting for everybody.
oh man, I was just excited watching it, and this was in the later end of my latter half of my, or currently in my career. I'm just watching it, and I'm just excited watching these guys because they're young, and you got to learn how to train and teach and raise up individuals to do the right thing, even when they just come into the industry. I think it's interesting. I've interviewed for lots of jobs, and I've been a consultant and all of that. And everybody wants to have 50 years of experience, and yet they hire a person with 5 years experience. So it's like that's kind of a strange paradigm, right? I mean, but at any rate, I'm an avid. I think we ought to learn along the way and learn new concepts and new principles. And I'm an avid learner. So, and I hope I never change. I was thinking, I've been telling a lot of positive outcomes of projects I've been on, but not everything is positive. You do have stress. You do have times when you think, oh, geez, are we off, right? Do we need to readjust? Are we off course? And requirements is a prime example of that. We write a requirement and we get moving down. And, in the project, you realize, on one particular project, I realized, oh, well, that requirement is not lined up with the outcome or what the organization goal is, right? To put us in line. And I think the issue isn't that, we had a requirement we had to fix, the stress of, oh, we're heading down the wrong path. I think the part was that I had to correct, or I guess the team had to correct what we were doing. We had to make an adjustment, and that goes back to adaptability, and then the resilience comes into play, right? And then there's always rework, and it caused us rework. It caused us to go back in. But I've always made the attempt to say, okay, my requirements were off, and I admitted to that. And then, but not just admitted to it, because I think there's a difference from admitting to something and providing or proposing a solution on how to fix where the misstep. And in my career, that's better received than anything that I've ever done, where I've gone back and said, you know what, maybe it was just a misunderstanding on our part, or on my part in particular, but we're proposing that we do this, and then give them timelines and things that will show them that we're making corrections. And then I'm also a firm believer of over promise, under promise and over deliver, right? So I had to get that right. Where I told on a particular project, we had to fix a few things. I told them it'd take us 2 months, and I just set that expectation right up front. And they didn't like it, but they knew it had to be done. And then we delivered it in 3 weeks, because the team realized they had the time, but they also acknowledged the fact that we had to fix it. And so they came back and they worked a little extra harder on that. And so, yeah, I think on the positive side of things, there's a lot of positive notes from projects I've been on, but I've been on lots of negative sides as well. But I think it just depends. That's where resiliency plays, where you've got to figure out how you're going to react and what you're going to do to not just fix it, but to offer up a solution to give your executive sponsor or your key stakeholders the ability to make a very good decision and to help you come to that positive outcome. So I was working in mergers and acquisitions projects. They had purchased a company out of California, and when I was working the project, I wasn't just working, bringing in all the IT stuff, but I was doing all of it. The people, the phones, the systems, the platforms. I think the most difficult part of that project was the people. We talked about the people. And in one of those situations, we had two individuals, one from the current company I was consulting with, and then the one that we had just purchased, or the one that the company just purchased in the merger. And they did the same thing. And so the discussion was, and this kind of goes to the organizational change management, right? How do you adapt that new company into your policies, into your procedures, into how you do things, but then also, look at people as well, which has a whole other dynamic of not just, if the system breaks, you got to fix it, or if your framework is set and you got to adjust and adapt, okay, well, let's do that. People have emotions, right? And so we had to decide. In fact, I was involved. They asked my opinion on what to do with that one individual and where he would land. And so we had to review his experience and where we could put him. And, and sometimes interviews come into play, where it maybe not an outright, hey, I want to interview you. It's more of a, hey, can we just chat for a minute, and then have a discussion to get a feel for what other things they know and what they can do, and then bring that back to the table to have those discussions. And so from a people standpoint, in that mergers and acquisitions, that was probably the toughest, I would say, in my career, is the toughest thing I ever had to deal with, is when people were involved in deciding, well, we already have a director of project management. We don't need a second director of project management. Do we make him a senior project management? Do we put him in a RIF? Do we make him another manager over a different group? Do we have any positions for that? Those are the things that a lot of companies, when you're doing mergers, think about. And that was probably, oh boy, is probably the most difficult thing I ever had to do in my career. So yeah, it's funny because of all the projects, I think the human element is always negated or forgotten about. And I'm a very positive person. So if I have a project that seems to be going astray, I'm very positive. Like, okay, we can get this fixed. We can provide solutions. We can, but I'm always conscious about who I'm dealing with and what I'm dealing with. And when I was dealing with a conflict on another project, it was kill them with kindness, right? And so even though they were sitting there just, I don't like this, and I want to, and just complain. I would just say, well, let's try this, or let's do this. And I would, present a solution, or try to keep them, engaged in a positive way. And the human elements, I think, forgotten in our industry. And it's interesting with AI coming into play here. I think a lot of people think, oh, AI is going to take my job, or this and that. It's really just a tool for us to use, because we need to have that human, compassionate, ethical, interaction and professional interaction with people. And AI is just a tool that I use in my project management career as of late, to really augment, my ability to do things, and to really reduce my administrative tasks in the work that I have to do there.